And so a copy of the recording and the slides will be sent out to all of the participants and anyone who registered for the webinar after the event. So welcome. My name's Amy Jandutha English. I'm the project director here at NCAP, the Energy Partnerships Project. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Derek Schrader. Before we turn it over for his excellent weatherization technical content, we're going to go through a couple of announcements. Next slide, please. So I hope to see each and every one of you at our annual convention this year, taking place in Seattle the last week of August. There's a QR code on your screen that you can scan, or you can also visit our website, www.communityactionpartnership.com to register there. We do also have registration open for an energy pre-conference session with today's speaker, as well as a number of other panelists talking about a variety of technical details in WAP administration. Next slide. I hope that everybody today, if you're not already subscribed to our newsletter or following us on social media, will go ahead and do so. That's a great way to be informed about webinars like the one today, about conference sessions like the one that's coming up, and to participate in further conversations around some of the issues that we discuss. Next slide. So we always begin our webinars here at NCAP by reciting the promise of community action. Not everybody does this, but I would invite folks to come off mute and say it out loud with us if you can. The promise of community action. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Next slide. Okay, I'll turn it over to Derek Schrader.
All right, thank you, Amy. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at in the WAP land, if you will. My name is Derek Schrader, and I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Program Manager for the Department of Energy's Weatherization Assistance Program. And today we're going to dive into a little bit deeper on the non-energy impacts and training for planning and implementation. Next slide, please. The agenda for today is I want to do a kind of a brief introduction of non-energy impacts. What have some of the historical barriers been? What are some of the key benefits if a grantee determines to include non-energy impacts? We're going to discuss Weatherization Program Notice 22-10, which actually provides the methodology of how grantees can incorporate non-energy impacts into their Weatherization Assistance Program. Those are the social cost of carbon, fuel switching and non-energy impacts approvals, and water usage reductions. And then lastly, we're going to cover future updates to the current non-energy impact guidelines. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right, so a quick introduction to non-energy impacts. Non-energy impacts are additional benefits for participants in energy efficiency beyond the energy cost savings gained from installing energy efficient measures. Those NEIs are also referred to as non-energy benefits, but for consistency reasons, WAP decided to use non-energy impacts. By using the term non-energy impacts, it broadens the scope of beyond just a non-energy benefit. It allows us to really kind of think outside the box and see what else can we potentially bring into the cost effectiveness calculation that determines savings to investment ratio numbers for the Weatherization Assistance Program. Next slide. So where does this come from? For years, we've heard from the network of wanting to include non-energy impacts and or benefits into the cost effectiveness calculation. However, what it required was an act of Congress to update our statutory language to give us the go-ahead to be able to do so. Until fiscal year 2020, when the program was reauthorized, WAP was statutorily required to only calculate the savings to investment ratio or the benefit to the low-income client on purely energy savings. In the reauthorization of the program, it allows the Weatherization Assistance Program at the Secretary's discretion to begin considering non-energy benefits. As soon as that was written into law, we hit the ground running of seeing how can we start looking at non-energy impacts and benefits that would better improve the services that we're able to provide low-income clients. Next slide, please. So what are some of the historical barriers for including non-energy impacts in WAP? Some non-energy related impacts of weatherization are very difficult to quantify in terms of savings to investment ratio or cost effectiveness. So what this bullet is meaning is if we being DOE are going to put something out as an optional inclusion into the program, we want to make sure that there's a statistically significant level of confidence in the non-energy impact that we're going to put out. This is where you see where we landed on items like social cost of carbon and water usage reduction. Those items are very defensible when it comes to the numbers that are behind them as part of the calculation. While we all agree that there's multiple non-energy benefits and non-energy impacts that could potentially be calculated into the cost effectiveness calculation, often there's times that the data supporting that does not have that high level of a degree of confidence in it. And for us to protect these types of pieces of guidance so that they can live and withstand many different factors, we want to make sure that we're putting out guidance that is going to be able to live for multiple years so that the weatherization grantees and sub-grantees are able to take advantage of what these do provide. Other items are flexibility of energy audits to incorporate potential non-energy impacts. While it's easy for DOE to push out guidance that allows the inclusion of this, there's often a lot of work that needs to happen at the energy modeling software level. While DOE does have control of Weatherization Assistant and the ability to institute updates into that, the entire network does not utilize Weatherization Assistant and its suite of tools, nor are they required to do so. At a grantee's discretion, they can use privately developed energy modeling software or state-developed modeling software. And the inclusion of these new non-energy impacts often takes software engineering to ensure that the behind-the-scenes calculations are being calculated accurately. Another item is that there is a potential negative impact on fuel switching. When increasing the SIR for non-energy benefits, it's very important that when we are weatherizing homes that we're not doing anything that would potentially increase the energy burden for low-income clients. So what this doesn't mean is that fuel switching should not happen. Fuel switching should absolutely happen, but it just takes a little more watchful eye from the state and the local and the contractors to ensure that the comprehensive package of measures that we're installing with the increased SIR that's realized out of this is not increasing the energy burden for the low-income client. And additionally, certain metrics and variables can vary very significantly by region and scope, such as emission rates and for electricity production. That's where you'll see when DOE issues these types of flexibilities and opportunities, often we try to do it as simply as possible. That doesn't necessarily capture down to the level of perhaps city and or county region climatic differences. The reason for that is because it would make it extremely difficult for adoption procedures if we were to put out all of those different types of non-energy impact inclusions that have all of the weather stations and everything else that goes into the cost effectiveness calculation. Although, even though DOE puts this out at that type of level, it does not stop from states of considering their own non-energy impacts and benefits to submit to DOE for consideration that can be much more regionally specific. Next slide, please. So what are some of the non-energy impact benefits that can be realized if a state determines that they would like to adopt so? The first and foremost is the increase in the cost effectiveness of WAP measures and measures that can be installed with WAP funds. At any time that we're adding calculations that increase the cost effectiveness or the savings to investment ratio, it opens up the opportunity for a more comprehensive set of packages to be installed for low-income clients. There's also the benefit of addressing the long-term impacts of carbon emissions. When looking at non-energy impacts from a climate standpoint, where we're able to utilize things like the social cost of carbon, we may not be saving a tremendous amount on an individual home, but when you start taking those steps back to take a look at how many homes perhaps your agency completes or how many homes that perhaps the state completes, and then to step even further back of how many homes that DOE funding completes over the course of a year, those small numbers of reduction at a site-specific home really start to multiply when you're looking at 35,000 homes or dwelling units a year that are served with DOE WAP funding. And then if you consider leveraged funding sources, that number increases by fivefold easily. So you can see how weatherization does absolutely help address long-term impacts of carbon emissions. And additionally, non-energy impact benefits address the impacts of drought and domestic water availability. I'll touch on this a little bit more when we get to that section of the presentation, but you'll see where water saving has also become a way to increase SIRs of dwelling units. Next slide, please. And remember, this is not a directive for states or locals to incorporate non-energy benefits or non-energy impacts into the cost effectiveness of their calculations. It is purely optional. At the grantee's discretion, they can make the determination to adopt or to not adopt the non-energy impact capabilities. We will only approve grantees that have a current and unexpired energy audit approval in place. So for grantees that perhaps maybe have an expired energy audit approval, meaning their energy audit tool and processes, the first step that needs to happen is making sure that they have an approved energy audit tool and approval, including their processes. Once that's done, then we can take a look at potentially incorporating non-energy impacts. And the other thing, too, to keep in mind is that a grantee can include non-energy impacts at any point in time within the approval cycle of their energy audit tool and or processes. It's not required to wait until your next certification cycle to include these types of benefits. Next slide, please. So with laying the foundation of non-energy impacts and how we got to where we are and the ability for us to start including to do so, the result of that was the release of Weatherization Program Notice 22-10, otherwise known as Including Non-Energy Impacts in WAP. What this does is set the capability for the network to include the social cost of carbon by establishing using national emissions profile for each field type, as well as water usage reduction based upon a site-specific utility cost for water savings. Grantees may request inclusion of other non-energy impacts in their program following the procedures outlined in Weatherization Program Notice 23-6 and Attachment 6 for special materials and approval. DOE will review grantee submissions for their applicability and more broadly in the program as well. And what this last bullet does is if we receive requests for other types of non-energy benefits or other types of non-energy impacts that are not social cost of carbon or water usage reduction, if we're able to provide approval to that to the grantee, we will then want to see, is this something that could better fit the entire WAP network? Do we have enough level of confidence in the data underneath it that if we do put it out for the entire WAP network, that it'll be able to survive for years and years to come? Next slide, please. So let's start with social cost of carbon. What is the social cost of carbon? That is the monetary value of the net harm to society associated with adding carbon to the atmosphere every year. The values provided within this WPN are established by the Interagency Working Group on the Social Cost of Greenhouse Gas. And the implementation methodology for this, or how do we actually include it in the cost effectiveness calculation, was by extrapolating that into fuel price modifiers, which are added to the site-specific fuel cost when analyzing measured cost effectiveness. So essentially what this means is by taking the per ton cost of the social cost of carbon by its fuel type, we're able to add a cost modifier to the individual fuel types that the energy audit tool is using. Next slide, please. So what does that look like in reality with the actual fuel types? So with the current program notice, if a grantee were to incorporate this, you'll see that for electric emissions, the grantee would add 1.99 cents per kWh to electric costs. For natural gas, you would add an additional 28.04 cents per therm for natural gas costs. For liquid propane or LP, you would add 30.48 cents to the cost of propane. And for heating oil or number two oil, fuel oil emissions, you would add 54 cents to the per gallon cost within the energy audit tool. So immediately, an individual can take a look at this and see how it significantly increases the fuel cost, which has a direct impact on the cost effectiveness of the individual measures and the package of measures. Next slide, please. For option two, and this is if the energy audit tool can accept different fuel modifiers by year, and it's not just a static cost that's behind the scene, we, WAP, do suggest that you use option two with the fuel cost modifiers in table 1 of that program notice. And what this does is it adds the social cost of carbon over roughly a 24-year period, so that you're kind of getting that average that weights out towards the end of the cycle of the cost effectiveness. Not all energy audit tools have this capability. Several do have that capability within the program. And if you do have one that does so, we would highly recommend that you utilize this. However, if not, the grantee can absolutely use the single point fuel cost modifier to be able to still realize the benefits of the social cost of carbon inclusion into the cost effectiveness calculation. Next slide, please. So for social cost of carbon, the electric emissions modifier option, there's two options allowed in this guidance for choosing the electric emissions. And those are to use the national average values provided in attachment 1, or to B, use national average values for on-site combustion provided in attachment 1 of this revised program guidance, but use an electric emissions modifier calculated specifically for the region or state that the grantee serves. What this does is it allows it to be more pinpointed to the areas that you serve. So example, if you're using option 2, then the following guidelines apply to the electric rate: that you must use the binding electric sector policies to account for projected reductions in electric emissions, as well as using the proper discount to present value rate when predicting future emissions for cost savings. Next slide, please. So to also implement the social cost of carbon in its program, the grantee must do the following steps, which the grantee is the state, prior to receiving approval. Step 1 is a written request to include social cost of carbon in fuel pricing to their technical project officer of record. The second step of that is the exact fuel price modifier to be used for each fuel analyzed by the grantee. And that's where you'll see the two options. There's the single point, or there's the one where you can go out multiple years. The next step is a sample energy cost library, which includes the fuel price modifiers selected by the grantee and provided to the subgrantees for implementation. And what DOE is doing here is really just ensuring that there wasn't a data entry error or a data discrepancy error with the fuel cost modifier that's going to be utilized behind the scenes. And finally, updated energy audit procedures provided to direct the energy audit process in the initial evaluation and site-specific energy modeling to include social cost of carbon. After a grantee receives the written approval memo by means of an updated energy audit approval memo, you may then begin to implement the social cost of carbon. Some of the things that specifically we're going to be looking for in those energy audit procedures, we touched on it a little bit earlier, is fuel switching. We do want to make sure that there is an increased level of oversight and watchful eye to ensure that the low-income client is not going to result in a higher energy burden for a potential fuel switch from a fossil and or delivered fuel over to electric. Next slide, please. So for fuel switching impact of social cost of carbon, we've touched on this quite a bit, where you need to have a higher level of oversight, closer watchful eye, that your policies are having some form of review and approval standpoint that comes through the grantee office. We don't necessarily identify exactly how it is that you're supposed to do that analysis, but we do provide some examples where the analysis to ensure that the energy burden is not increasing could be of the heating and cooling annual cost for each potential fuel type without the inclusion of the social cost of carbon in the fuel prices, including any cooling costs that did not previously exist in the home due to the addition of cooling via installation of a heat pump system. So what this does by running the energy audit without the fuel cost modifiers, it will give you a true reflection of the fuel costs of will there be a net positive for that low income client and not a negative impact with the increase of energy burden. Because there is instances where switching from a fossil fuel and or delivered fuel and moving over to a heat pump, that the client will then be able to realize the benefit of air conditioning, which is a very positive thing for the low income clients. However, that does also increase the load on the home where there was previously cooling costs that may not have been in place that will now be in place. So running that energy audit to get that true determination without the social cost of carbon and fuel cost modifier in place, with those measures installed, will give you that estimated savings in terms of dollars for that low income client to ensure that we are, putting in the right comprehensive package for them. Next slide, please. So where are we currently at within the DOE funded program for fuel switching approvals in the social cost of carbon approvals? To date, Alaska, California, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, Oregon, and Wisconsin are the grantees that have fuel switching approvals with DOE WAP funding. I do want to point out that there's often a misconception that DOE WAP dollars are not able to be utilized for fuel switching, and I'm here today to tell you that is not accurate. Weatherization Program Notice 23-6 provides an avenue and a process for grantees to either on a case-by-case submittal process or to oversee it at the grantee level where things do not have to be submitted to DOE to include fuel switching as part of their DOE funded program. So for non-energy impacts or social cost of carbon, the following states or the following grantees have included social cost of carbon: Alaska, California, Colorado, Illinois, Kansas, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. And if I've seen the chat correctly, it appears that the state of Iowa is going through the process right now to also include the social cost of carbon. As with anything that DOE puts out, we often see a relatively slow uptake at first, but as more and more grantees come on board with the availability of these types of things, we start to see what's almost like a snowball effect, or more and more. So as we continue down this, because 22-10 is still a relatively new piece of program guidance, we anticipate that we'll see more and more states incorporate the social cost of carbon into the fold of what they can offer, as well as fuel switching approvals, because both of these combined absolutely are able to increase savings to investment ratios and increase the comprehensive level of measures that we are able to provide. Next slide, please. So just from a map purposes, where you can see from a fuel switching approval to where there's some overlap of fuel switching approval and non-energy impact social cost approval, one could almost could consider that like a great pairing of two opportunities. Pairing the fuel switching policy, which as a standalone is a really good addition to any grantee and sub-grantees weatherization assistance program, with the non-energy impact social cost of carbon, is just one way to really increase, as I said earlier, the cost effectiveness of what we're able to provide low-income clients. Next slide, please. So the next item is also allowed as part of 22-10, which is the water usage reduction. At this point in time, we do not have any grantees that have submitted their intentions to utilize water usage reduction as part of the cost effectiveness calculation. We do anticipate that we'll most likely see some of this increase, no different than with the social cost of carbon, is once one or two grantees incorporate it, work through it, we will most likely see even more. So historically, the water usage, there's not been a cost effectiveness on the actual reduction of water. So you may see things like low flow shower heads, flow restrictors, other types of like water type energy conservation measures, but energy auditing tools were not looking at it from a water usage reduction. They were looking at it from a reduced amount of therms, kWh, oil, whatever type of fuel it is that's being utilized to heat that water up. With the ability to now include water usage reduction, you'll still be able to take advantage of the cost effectiveness of the reduced amount of fuel needed to heat that water up, as well as the actual water usage reduction itself. We highly encourage grantees to consider incorporating this because it also potentially opens the network up to non-traditional measures that have not been done for within the program. Some of those that potentially could be there is low flow toilets, potentially energy saving or water reducing clothes washers or dishwashers. Obviously, these things do fall outside of Appendix A, which is the materials that are allowed for use within the Weatherization Assistance Program. But DOE does have a process for states to be able to incorporate non-Appendix A materials into the Weatherization Assistance Program. Next slide, please. So as I was just stating, is a lot of these items that are considered non-traditional weatherization measures that some of these, like water usage reduction, allows the network to consider, do fall outside of 10 CFR 440 Appendix A. So the simple process for grantees to incorporate those non-Appendix A materials is they need to submit a package to DOE WAP of roughly three energy models that demonstrate, with the use of water usage reduction, that things like low flow toilets, perhaps clothes washers, dishwashers, are able to calculate a savings to investment ratio of 1.0 or higher, and the standards that the state plans on utilizing are the minimum standards for those types of materials. Next slide, please. So to adopt the water usage reduction measures, similar to the social cost of carbon, here is the process that states must follow. A special materials request from 23-6 for the revised energy audit procedures must include those water saving measures, a sample energy model of each item using the approved energy audit tool, as well as the written procedures that are provided to direct the energy audit process in the initial audit, evaluation, energy modeling, and final inspection of each measure. Because anytime that we're adding new materials or new technology, we want to make sure that the state is providing proper level of information to the local network from how to incorporate this into the energy model, as well as for the contractors and the final inspectors, whether it's in-house or contracted, to inspect these to the requirements that are in place. Next slide, please. So updates to the non-energy impact guidelines. DOE is actively working on updating Weatherization Program Notice 22-10 with newer cost per ton for the social cost of carbon information. While this is not quite yet released, we are working through the internal processes and procedures to get the approval to do so. What we are able to say is that there is the potential to see a 5-fold increase of the fuel price modifiers on all types of fuels. So what this effectively does is dramatically increase the savings to investment ratio across the entire board. It increases SIR for all measures, all fuel types, and expands upon the comprehensive capability of the DOE-funded Weatherization Assistance Project. In doing so, for states that utilize leverage funding in a braiding mechanism, it really opens up the door for providing as many energy conservation measures that are possible on low-income client homes. Next slide. So the thing that I want to cover too is, as part of this update, it's going to be very similar to the first update. We're trying to keep this as simple as possible. Similar, we're going to use the national average to do a standalone fuel cost modifier, as well as an option 2, where if an energy audit tool has the ability to put out year beyond like a single set price, the ability to put in those out year looks for the fuel cost modifiers. Next slide, please. And with that, I know that was only 30 minutes, but it leaves us plenty of time to go through questions that are either being received in the chat, or if individuals want to come off mute and ask their question, I would encourage them to do so with that as well.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Derek. Oh, I'm hearing an echo. Is anyone else hearing an echo? Okay, I'll ignore it. We did have some good conversation in the chat. We've got some folks from Iowa, like you said, saying that they're going to be applying or they're finalizing their application for social cost of carbon. Nebraska says they're already doing it.
Mhm.
I think those would be the two best questions to lead with. Is there anybody in the room today that is already using social cost of carbon or considering either that or the water use reduction? And if so, like what would be if you're not doing it, what would be the barriers that you're afraid of? And what we can do is you can either use the Q&A at the bottom or you can raise your hand and we'll bring you on to talk. Don't freak out. You don't have to be on camera, but since we're recording it, if you could say the question out loud, it makes it easier for the people who listen later to get the full conversation. Okay, well, I'm not seeing, oh, Chase. Chase Counts, please go ahead and speak.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, we
Yes,
can
we
hear
can.
you.
Great. Hey, yeah, consultant for NCAP, and dropped my question in the chat, but I was curious on you mentioned the current and unexpired energy audit approvals being necessary by the grantees. Where could a sub-grantee or a state association potentially find that information? Would that be included in the WAP state plans?
Typically in the state plan, you would find some language around the approval cycle for the energy audit tool that is there. Um, what we don't share is, because the requirement for the approval of an energy audit tool and process is regulatory, and if a state does not have that in place, there is the potential that we will have an action item known as either a finding or a concern that's issued. We don't share state action items publicly. Those are things that, as part of our oversight, that we work through as a partner with the state to bring those individual programs back into compliance. But yes, starting at the state plan is a great spot, because there is a requirement in the annual application or as part of the state plan that they identify what energy audit tool is being utilized, and the approval cycle on it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. We had a question from Linda Timbers. Would you like to say it out loud, Linda?
I don't know if you can hear me, can you?
Yes, we can.
Oh, surprise. I'm having internet problems today. I was just wondering if this is going to carry over into DOE bill.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no restriction on this being part of the annual funded program or the bipartisan infrastructure or bill funded program. And
Yay.
when a grantee or a state receives approval for their energy audit tool and processes, which is where the social cost of carbon would live, that approval is for their use across both grants. It's not like a separate approval to their process or their tool for bill awards, which it significantly simplifies things. I couldn't imagine if we had to do like separate approvals for that. That'd be something.
Yeah, I hope that answered your question, Linda. I don't see any new questions, but I have a question about the water use reduction angle. I find that very exciting. I know that water affordability and accessibility are incredibly important everywhere, but in certain parts of the country more than others. And so I'm wondering, so you as the presenter, Derek, what do you think is the future arc for adoption of water use reduction? Are there particular states that you anticipate will be the first to adopt it? Or when you were putting it together, how did the smart people at DOE figure that it might roll out?
That's a really good question. So I think I don't have any like idea of who I think the first state will be by any means at all. I think what we DOE need to do is a better job of detailing how things like low flow restrictors and shower heads historically have been calculated from a cost effectiveness standpoint.
Mhm.
And the fact that water usage reduction has not been part of it at all. It's only been on, the reduced need for therms or KWH or whatever it might be. Um, so if like we can do a better job of that communication aspect of like this is above and beyond what you're already getting for an SIR. So I don't know if there's perhaps like a misconception that well we already do low flow
Mhm.
restrictors and shower heads. We don't really necessarily need that because it's already being calculated. Um, how can we make sure that we're getting that message across? Like it's above and beyond what you currently have, so it's going to increase the SIR of those traditional, for lack of better terms, measures. But look at what else it could potentially provide. I know that the look at what else it could potentially provide also requires another approval step because it's often materials that are outside of Appendix A. And that's where I think like we DOE need to continually keep talking about how we've made every attempt to simplify the process to receive approval for non-Appendix A
Mhm.
materials. Minimizing the amount of examples that need to be put forth and allowing states to just put forth what standards do you intend on using. What recognized standards would you use for a low flow toilet or perhaps a clothes washing machine.
Mhm.
So I don't feel like I answered your question perfectly on that because I don't have a feel on who the first state will be, except for how can we DOE just do a better job of messaging the benefit and increase in SIR that this would provide.
Mhm. Well, and I'm thinking too about the cost of the water. So I would assume that it would be of most value to the
Yep.
agencies that are serving water burdened residents. So there are
Mm-hmm.
places where the water bills are the most unaffordable.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um,
Absolutely.
so, all right. Thank you, Derek. I don't see any other questions. I wonder if we should just give our attendees back a little bit of their time or stick around for any
Yeah.
further discussion. Does anyone have any questions before we close out?
And if I would encourage folks to like, just when this webinar wraps up, doesn't necessarily mean that your opportunity to ask a question has been lost.
Right.
If you have a lingering question or something, comes up afterwards based on a discussion perhaps you're having with your team, please feel free to reach out to Amy. She's a fantastic partner with the network, and she would most certainly relay those questions to DOE so we could figure out some type of mechanism to respond to those.
I do have one final question too, just for clarification. With things like this that do need to be run through the state plan, is there
Mm-hmm.
a mechanism for, I know in some states there can be places where maybe certain subgrantees have interest in using like
Mm-hmm.
non-energy impacts and others don't. How flexible is that? Is there a way, is it something where if the state adopts it, everyone in the whole state has to use it, or is there optional, is there ability to be optional sort of built into that from a administrative standpoint?
I mean, we probably wouldn't get into the weeds of that from DOE's end of how a state wants to design that. Like if they wanted to implement social cost of carbon and
Mm-hmm.
or water savings, whatever it might be, um, based on the desire from let's say 50% of the community action agencies for that state. And I'm just grabbing numbers out of the air here. I don't think that we would have it. We don't have it in here that it would then be a requirement because you've selected the optional social cost of carbon that it becomes a
Mm-hmm.
requirement for your entire network. The whole purpose of this was to put forth optional capabilities that support the network. So in a roundabout long way of me saying something that to be at the state's discretion,
Mhm.
how to do so. Like I do not believe that we would reject a plan that, some of the subgrantees with community action agencies are utilizing it and some of them are not. We would encourage, everyone to consider using it because it does boost SIRs, but we would not reject it.
Thank you. I think I didn't do a good job asking that
Yeah.
question, but I will just reiterate. I think what I was trying to get at is for anyone who's on today that may be interested in using
Mm-hmm.
the NEIs, but finds that their state is hesitant to adopt it, it's an important talking point that the state could craft the plan in such a way that it doesn't require the entire state to do it. So in
Mm-hmm.
other words, if you're getting pushback from the state because maybe it's not needed throughout the state, there's room in there to do it. So that's the
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing where you'd want to touch base with us to get clarification. So everybody, as I said, is going to get an email from me with the
Mm-hmm.
slides and a link to the recording. So that's a great opportunity to just reply and
Yeah.
say, hey, I had one more question. So I look forward to seeing more of these
I'll add one
familiar names in the
thing.
future. Mhm.
I'll add one more thing on this too. So, we often do get the question of, well, it's optional, but why has my state not adopted it? There's often a lot of factors that go into play of why a state may or may not adopt one of these types of optional items. Um, One of those may be we are aware that in some states, through energy efficiency programs, it's a state law or code or statute that does not allow for fuel switching. So like in those areas, that's the authority having jurisdiction. So there can also very much be a very, very real reason or barrier of why a state's unable to adopt something like a fuel switching process. It may be something that they're not allowed to do because of a state statute or a state law that's in place for energy efficiency programs. So, but just having those conversations, throughout the process, whether it's through a technical advisory group or the public hearing for the state plan, information is power. So, like understanding those also helps understand, like, well, if we can't do this, where else can we look for streamlining or efficiencies into our program?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for your time, Derek, and thank you for everyone
Yeah,
sticking around and asking questions. So I look forward to, like I was saying, I see a lot of familiar names in here. So I'm glad that you keep coming back for our webinars, and I hope to see some of you in Seattle. So take care and have a good day.